You ask me what's the most interesting structure I ever worked on in 55 years of carpentry in Custer County. I'll tell you, but you'll be disappointed first. I didn't build it. I didn't design it. I didn't even understand it, not entirely, not for a long time. The most interesting structure I ever saw in this county was built by a woman who had never read a word about construction in her life, using material that any sensible man would have dismissed without a second look, on a claim 14 miles south of Broken Bow during the autumn and winter of 1898. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 34 years old when her husband August died of typhoid fever in the last week of August of that year. And if you want to understand what she built and why it mattered, you have to start with August. Not because he invented anything, he didn't, he was gone before the building started, but because what Clara built, she built from him, from what he'd left, from the preparations of a careful man who didn't live to use them. August Voss had filed his homestead claim in Custer County in the spring of 1895. He came west from Pickaway County, Ohio, with Clara and a baby on the way, that was Hannah, and the particular collection of convictions that brought men to the Nebraska tablelands in those years. He believed in the land surveys. He believed the railroad pamphlets. He believed in his own capacity for work, which was, as it turned out, not misplaced. I never met August Voss alive, but I saw everything he built, and a man's work tells you more about him than most men are willing to say out loud. The cabin, 14 by 16 feet, 2 rooms, board floor set level on a stone foundation, he'd fitted himself, not mortared but fitted, each stone chosen for its bearing surface. He had taken his time with that foundation. The floor did not creak. 3 years into a homestead claim, most men have a floor that announces every step. August Voss's floor was silent. The barn was sound. The well was 22 feet deep. He'd gone 4 feet deeper than he needed to because he didn't trust the table in a dry year, and he was right not to. The chicken coop he'd built from salvaged lumber the previous spring, each board fitted to its neighbor with more care than a chicken coop strictly required. Clara told me later that she'd asked him once why he was being so precise about a building that housed chickens. He'd said he didn't know how to build a thing badly on purpose, and he didn't see why he'd start learning. He pressed the bales in July, 200 of them, using a horse-powered press he'd borrowed from Werner Kast 4 miles north. Each bale dense and rectangular, tied with 2 lengths of seesaw twine, stacked south of the barn in rows 30 bales wide and 4 high in places. He covered the stack with a length of old canvas and weighted the canvas with stones against the prairie wind. Practical, neat, prepared. He had plans for those bales eventually, feed for a rough winter, bedding material, windbreak for a new structure come spring. He wasn't in a hurry with them. August Voss had a farmer's patience with things that could wait a season or two. 3 weeks after the last bale was pressed, the fever came. I won't linger on that. Typhoid fever in the late 19th century moved through a household faster than you expected and with less warning than you deserved. August was sick on a Thursday. By the following Wednesday, he was confused and couldn't keep water down. By the Thursday after that, Clara was digging a grave on the east edge of the claim, in ground she chose herself under a slope that caught the morning sun. She was a strong woman. She had no close neighbor she wanted to call on, not yet, not while she was still holding the shovel. She buried August on his own land on a morning when the sky was so clear and blue it seemed wrong, the particular blue that belongs to good days, not to the days when you bury the person who built the floor that doesn't creak. After the neighbors came and went, after the food was brought and the words were said, and the wagons had gone back east along the road toward town, Clara sat at the kitchen table and began to think about the winter. It was still August. She had 12 weeks, perhaps, before the first serious cold. She had $9 in a sugar tin above the stove. She had 2 children, Hannah, 8 years old, who held things steady by habit and by character, and Carl, 6, who handed you whatever you needed and counted things aloud as he gave them to you, a habit of his that Clara said August had encouraged. She had the claim, the cabin, the barn, the well, the chickens, and 200 bales of pressed prairie grass under a canvas weighted with stones. She did not sell the claim. She considered it, briefly, the way you consider a road you've already decided not to take, just long enough to understand what's down it, then long enough to turn away. The claim was August's last work. Her children were August's children. She was not going to hand either to a stranger in exchange for enough money to start over with nothing in Kearney. She went back to work. Gertrude Poole came in the first week of September, 7 miles east across the flat ground, with a covered pot and direct speech, and the kind of concern that is all the more difficult to receive because it is entirely genuine. Gertrude was a fair-faced woman in her early 40s who had been on the prairie since 1886. She had built 2 houses with her husband Alton, a sod house first, then a frame house after the sod house taught her something she didn't want to learn twice. She had buried a child in 1890, a boy of 3 named Thomas, who had coughed for 6 weeks before he stopped. The cough had started in January, in a sod house with walls that wept moisture in the cold and never fully dried between November and March. Gertrude had made the connection. She had made it in the way you make connections that cost you something, not as a theory, but as a fact she carried in her chest. She sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank coffee and said what she had come to say. "You can't stay the winter." Clara thanked her for the pot, which contained a very good beef stew, and said she intended to stay. "I'm not talking about the cold," Gertrude said. "People always think I'm talking about the cold. I'm talking about what comes with cold when you're in a cabin you can't heat properly. You know what lives in a damp wall? In a wall that gets cold at night and sweats in the morning and never dries all the way through?" She looked at Clara steadily. "I know what lives there. I lost my boy Thomas to what lives there. He was 3 years old, and he coughed for 6 weeks, and the cough started in our sod house, in January, when we were burning everything we had and the walls were still sweating." Clara was quiet. "You've got 2 children," Gertrude said. "Small lungs. A cabin you can't get ahead of. The cold isn't what'll get you. The damp will. The cold and the damp together will, and they always come together out here, and there's no winning that fight in a cabin that doesn't seal." Clara said she understood. "Come to town for the winter," Gertrude said. "Find work. Come back in spring with real money and do it properly. There's no shame in it. There's no shame in knowing what you're up against." They sat together for a while after that without saying much. Gertrude was not unkind. She had not come to deliver a verdict and depart. She had come because she meant what she said, and she wanted Clara to hear it from someone who had reason to say it. She stayed until the afternoon was going, helped with the washing up, and drove her wagon back east along the road toward her own place. Clara stood at the kitchen window after she'd gone and looked out at the field south of the barn. The canvas-covered bale stack was visible from where she stood, a long, low shape, pale in the September afternoon, the canvas lifting slightly at one corner where the wind had got under the stones. She had been walking past that stack every morning for 3 weeks. She had been pressing her hand against the exposed side of a bale at the end of the row each time she went to the barn, not intentionally, not with any purpose in mind, just the absent habit of a person who touches things to know what they are. The straw was dense and dry and cool. The outer few inches had weathered some color, but in it, she had tested this with her thumb, pressing into the exposed cut face of a bale at the end of a row where the twine had loosened. Inside it was as dry and compressed as the day it was pressed. She thought about what Gertrude had said, not about leaving. She had already turned away from that road. She thought about the specific shape of Gertrude's fear, damp, not cold, walls that wept, a child who coughed. She thought about August's bales. Straw was dry. She knew this the way she knew the weight of a flour sack, or the sound the well rope made when the bucket hit water, not as information she'd read somewhere, but as a fact she'd handled. Straw was hollow, too. Each stalk a small sealed tube of nothing, of stopped air, and August had pressed 200 bales of it, 60 pounds each, dense as anything she'd lifted since she was a girl stacking hay on her father's farm in Ohio, and they were sitting in a field under a canvas 20 yards from the cabin that leaked cold and, as Gertrude had correctly identified, would collect damp the moment the temperature dropped far enough. She didn't have an idea yet, not a complete one. She had a material and a problem, and the memory of Gertrude's voice saying damp, not cold, and she had the habit of a woman who thought while she worked and worked while she thought. She turned from the window. She went to the shelf above the stove and took down August's land survey form, the one the county office had sent when the claim was filed, with his name printed at the top in the clerk's neat hand. August Rolfe Voss, Section 14, Custer County, Nebraska. She turned it over to the blank side. She put it on the table. She found the pencil stub in the kitchen drawer. She sat down. She didn't draw anything yet. She held the pencil and looked at the blank paper and thought about the bale she had pressed her hand against this morning, the one at the end of the row with the loosened twine, dry and still inside, while the September wind moved the canvas overhead. Then Hannah called from the other room that Carl had knocked over the water bucket again, and Clara put the pencil down and went to deal with that first. The idea didn't arrive all at once. I want to be clear about this because there's a version of the story, the version people tell when they want it to be more than it is, where Clara Voss walked out to that bale stack one September morning and saw in an instant what no one else had seen and understood it fully and set to work. That version is cleaner and it fits better in the space of a short telling. It is also wrong. The truth, as she explained it to me years later when I finally asked her directly, is that she thought about the bales for 2 weeks before she understood what she was thinking. She thought while she hauled water. She thought while she dressed the chickens and banked the stove and listened to Hannah read Carl his lessons in the evenings. She thought the way practical people think about practical problems, not all at once, and not in a straight line, but in the way that water finds its level, circling the low point for a while before it settles there. What broke it open was the children. It was the second week of October. The nights had turned serious. Not the worst cold yet, nothing like what January would bring, but the kind of cold that reminds you it has plans. Clara woke sometime past midnight to find the bed in the second room empty. Both children gone, the blankets pushed aside. She was out the door before she'd finished the thought. Boots not fully laced, coat thrown over her nightgown, the lantern lit in the time it takes a frightened woman to move from a dead stop to a full one. She crossed the yard to the barn, pulled the door, and climbed the loft ladder with the lantern held above her head. She found them in the straw. Not loose straw exactly. August had stored the overflow from the pressing up here, the amounts too small to bale, piled against the east wall of the loft. Hannah had made a nest of it the way a capable child makes a nest when she's cold enough to be inventive. A hollow in the center, walls pulled up on 3 sides, herself and Carl burrowed in together with the particular boneless abandon of children who have found exactly what they needed and stopped looking. They were warm. Clara stood at the top of the loft ladder with the lantern and looked at them. She reached down and touched Hannah's cheek. The comfortable warmth of a sleeping child in a warm room, not the faint chill at the surface that meant a child was fighting the cold in her sleep, but actual warmth, even in temperature steady. She took Carl's hand. His fingers, which in every winter morning she could remember had been the first thing to go cold, were unremarkable. Just his hands. She stood there longer than she needed to. Then she looked at the walls. August had stacked bales along the north and west sides of the barn every autumn for 3 years. She'd watched him do it without paying it particular attention, the way you don't pay attention to the things a careful person does routinely because the carefulness itself stops drawing notice. He'd gone floor to rafters on those 2 sides. In places, the bales were 3 layers deep, the outer faces pressed tight together, the whole mass of them sitting there, doing the quiet work they'd been doing every winter since he stacked them. Clara walked to the north wall and pressed her palm flat against the face of the nearest bale. Then she walked to the barn door, which faced south and stood open to the mild October night, and she pressed her palm against the bare board wall at the door's edge. The difference was not subtle. Through the board wall, the cold was immediate, not brutal, not the killing cold of January, but present, seeping. The kind of cold that reminds you it is on the other side and intends to be on this side eventually. Through the bale wall, nothing. Not warmth exactly. Stillness, the absence of transmission. The cold was out there, she knew it was out there, but the bale face offered no evidence of it. It was simply a surface, dense and dry and uninformed by whatever the air outside was doing. She stood with one hand on each wall for longer than made any practical sense. Then she went back to the children, sat against the loft wall with the lantern turned low, and let herself think. Here is what she was working out, as best I've been able to reconstruct it from what she told me and what I later understood from looking at the structure she built. Each stalk of dried prairie grass is hollow. You know this if you've ever snapped a straw between your fingers and looked at the broken end, a tube, sealed at each joint, a small cylinder of stopped air trapped inside a thin wall of dried fiber. A bale of compressed prairie grass contains thousands of these tubes, pressed together so tightly that the mass of them behaves almost like a single material. The trapped air inside each tube cannot move. Air that cannot move cannot carry heat from one place to another in the way that moving air does, cannot conduct warmth outward or cold inward with any efficiency. The bale sits there, and the temperature on one side stays largely ignorant of the temperature on the other. This is not mysterious. It is the same principle that makes a down quilt warmer than a canvas, one of the same weight, the same principle that makes a root cellar useful. Trapped still air is one of the most effective insulators in the natural world. Clara Voss didn't know any of this in those terms, but she knew it in the terms that matter. She'd felt it with both hands. What she was working out in that loft in October by lantern light was whether what she'd felt in the barn could be made to surround the cabin, not build a new house. She didn't have the bales for a new house, didn't have the time, didn't have the knowledge of foundation work that building from scratch required, and didn't, I think, want to build something new. The cabin was August's work. The floor that didn't creak was August's floor. She was not going to discard it and start over. What she was thinking about was a second skin. Press the bales against the exterior of the cabin walls, she thought. Stack them against the boards the way August had stacked them against the barn boards. Seal the outside face against moisture, because she was thinking about Gertrude's boy Thomas, about walls that wept, and she understood that the sealing was not optional. If the straw got wet, it would rot. And rotting straw in a wall was everything Gertrude had warned her about, and worse. But if it stayed dry, plastered over on the outside, sealed against rain and snowmelt, then the bales would do for the cabin what they did for the barn. They would put a thickness of stopped air between the boards and the January sky. The cabin walls would stay. The bale shell would be added to them. Two systems working separately, each doing what it did best. The cabin bearing the load, the bale shell bearing the cold. She sat in that loft until the sky began to gray to the east. She spent 2 weeks working out the details. This is the part of the story that tends to get left out when people tell it quickly, but I think it's the most important part because it shows you what kind of mind she had. She didn't begin until she was ready to begin. She thought through the problems in order. The first problem was attachment. Bales stacked against a wall will lean and drift under their own weight and under wind pressure if nothing holds them. She needed a way to pull each course tight to the course below it and to the wall itself. The answer was already in the barn, 3 spools of 14-gauge galvanized fence wire that August had bought the previous spring for a pasture fence he hadn't gotten to. Each spool nearly full. She spent an evening working out the threading. August's longest awl pushed through 5 bales in sequence, the wire following behind it, the ends looped back and twisted tight, with a bent nail used as a lever. She tested it on a short run of 3 bales against the barn's south wall and pushed against them with both hands. They didn't move. The wire drew the course together under pressure, the same way a cooper's hoop draws barrel staves together. The harder you push outward, the tighter the tension becomes. The second problem was plaster. Creek clay from the east bank of the south branch was the obvious material. She'd watched August use it for the root cellar floor, and she'd used it herself to fill gaps around the stovepipe elbow when the mortar cracked 2 winters back. It dried hard and shed water well enough if you applied it in the right thickness. The question was what to add to it for strength, because plain clay shrinks as it dries, and a pure clay coat cracks. She had read, 3 or 4 years back, in an almanac she'd since lost track of, that dried grass fiber mixed into adobe plaster prevented shrinkage cracking by giving the clay something to hold on to. She had retained this fact the way she retained facts that might be useful someday, filed and waited on. She would mix dried grass from the field into the clay at the second coat. 3 coats total, a rough first coat pressed directly against the straw to grip the stems, a second coat with grass fiber, a third coat smooth and dense enough to shed whatever the winter threw at it. The third problem was the survey form. She had been carrying it to the table and away from it for 2 weeks without drawing anything on it, and one evening after the children were asleep, she sat down with the pencil stub and made herself commit. A rectangle, the cabin's footprint. A second rectangle around it, offset by the width of a bale, the shell. She marked which faces would take 3 courses, north and west, the faces the worst weather came from, and which faces would take 2. She marked the south window with a small square and wrote next to it, "Leave clear, light." She marked the door. She worked out the bale count, 112 needed against the 200 August had pressed. She wrote the number at the bottom of the page. August's name was printed at the top, August Rolfe Voss, Section 14, Custer County, Nebraska. She looked at his name for a moment. Then she put the pencil down and put the survey form in the kitchen drawer, in the back behind the spoons, where she kept the things she needed to be able to find. She began on the 1st of November, a Monday, in the early cold of a morning that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. Carl helped from the start. He was 6 years old and couldn't carry a bale. They ran to 60 pounds, most of them, and he was a small boy. But he could do something more useful, as it turned out. He stationed himself at the bale stack and threaded the wire through each bale before his mother carried it, so that when Clara set it in place, the wire was already ready to be looped and drawn tight. He handed her the awl when she needed it. He handed her the wire ends and held them taut while she twisted the nail lever. And he counted, as he always counted, announcing each bale as it was set. 1, Mama. She pressed the first bale tight against the north face of the cabin, its end flush with the corner. 2. She set the second against it, end joints offset. She had decided from the start to stagger the courses the way a mason staggers brick, no joint running straight from top to bottom, the weakness of one layer interrupted by the strength of the next. 3. The morning was gray and still and cold enough that her breath showed, but not so cold that the clay she'd mixed the previous evening in the barn had frozen. She had 2 buckets of it covered with burlap to keep it workable. Between bales, she pressed handfuls of the clay into the gaps at the wire joints, not plastering yet, that came later, just filling, seating, taking away any channel that cold air might follow. Or 5. By mid-morning she had the first course of the north face half laid, 8 bales in a line against the boards wired and seated, the clay-filled joints already beginning to stiffen in the cold air. She stepped back and looked at it. It did not look like much. 8 bales against a wall, a row of dull gold rectangles muted by October weather, the wire visible at the top where it hadn't yet been covered. It looked exactly like what it was, the beginning of something that might work and might not. Built by a woman who had thought hard about it and committed to finding out. She picked up the next bale. 6, Mama, Carl said. 7. The plaster cracked on the 14th day. Clara had applied the first coat in the last week of October. A cold week, drier than she'd wanted, the air pulling moisture out of the clay faster than she'd expected. She had mixed the creek clay to what she thought was the right consistency, not too wet and not too stiff, and pressed it against the straw face of the north wall in long overlapping strokes with her bare hand, working from the base of each course upward, making sure it gripped the straw stems rather than sitting on top of them. It had gone on well. It had looked right. She had covered it with a canvas in the evenings to slow the drying, the way her father had covered fresh-poured clay floors in Ohio to keep them from drying too fast. On the 14th morning, she came out at first light and pulled back the canvas and found a network of fine cracks running across the surface of the first coat like a map of dry riverbeds. She stood and looked at it for a long time. The cracks were not deep. She ran her thumb across one, and it didn't widen or crumble, the clay on either side still firm. But a cracked plaster coat was not a sealed coat, and a coat that wasn't sealed was not doing what she needed it to do. She thought about what Gertrude had said about damp. She thought about the cracks as channels, small ones, but channels, and about what would happen in March when the snow on the north face began to melt and the water ran down the plaster and found the cracks and followed them in. She got a cup of coffee. She sat on the porch step in the cold morning and thought about the cracks. The cause was shrinkage. She understood this without needing to be told. She had seen it in plaster, in dried mud, in the cracked surface of any clay soil through a dry August. Clay shrinks as the water leaves it, and when it shrinks unevenly, drying faster on the surface than inside, or in one section faster than another, it pulls apart. The fix was not to apply more clay. The fix was to give the clay something to hold on to while it dried, something that resisted the shrinking. She thought about the almanac she'd lost, the one that had mentioned grass fiber in adobe plaster. She had been planning to add fiber to the second coat, but the second coat was supposed to go over a sound first coat, and the first coat had cracked. She mixed a new batch that afternoon. Half again as much dried grass fiber as she'd planned, cut short with August's hay knife so the strands were 2 inches or less, long enough to do something, short enough not to clump. She mixed it into the clay by hand, the way you mix lard into flour, working the fiber through until it was distributed evenly, and the whole batch had a different texture than plain clay, slightly resistant, pulling back against her fingers when she squeezed it. She applied it directly over the cracked first coat, pressing hard enough to fill the cracks from above before building the second layer out. This coat went on thicker. She worked it in circular strokes, not linear ones, so the fiber strands lay in multiple directions rather than all running the same way. It dried slower. The fiber was holding the moisture, releasing it gradually. And when she pulled back the canvas 3 mornings later, the surface was sound. She noted this in the margin of the survey form in the kitchen drawer. Fiber in all coats, not second only. More than you think. I drove past the Voss place on the 8th of November. I was coming back from the Hendricks job, 2 weeks of framing work 8 miles south, with a wagon of tools and a head full of the next job, which was a grain storage building for a man named Pritchard, who wanted it done before the hard cold set in. I was not paying particular attention to anything except the road and the light, which was already going at 4 in the afternoon the way it does in November when the days are finishing faster than you're ready for them to. I came over the low-rise north of the Voss claim, and I saw her in the field. From a distance, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. The cabin was the same cabin I'd seen 2 or 3 times over the past few years, driving this road. A small frame structure, 14 by 16, nothing remarkable about it, but around the lower half of the north and west sides, something had been added that altered the silhouette. The cabin looked thicker, lower and broader, as if it had settled into the ground. The color was different, not the weathered gray of the boards, but a darker, matte earth tone, the color of dried creek clay in a dry year. I pulled up the team and looked. The structure wasn't finished. I could see the top courses of bales still exposed on the west face, not yet plastered, the wire threading visible along their tops. But the north face was fully plastered from the ground up to the eave line, 3 courses of bales sealed under 2 coats of clay, the surface still slightly uneven but intact, no open cracks visible from the road. I didn't stop that day. I had the Pritchard job in my head and the light was going, and what I was seeing hadn't yet resolved itself into a question I knew how to ask. I drove on. But I thought about it the rest of that afternoon and through the evening, and the next morning I turned off the Broken Bow Road at the Voss Lane and drove down to the claim. Clara was at the west wall when I pulled up, working the 3rd coat onto the upper course of bales, a coat that was visibly denser and smoother than the layers beneath it. She heard the wagon and looked up and looked back at her work. I got down and tied the team to the porch post and walked around the cabin once before I said anything. I want to be precise about what I saw because I have been imprecise about it in my own memory for years, filling in what I understood later over what I actually observed then. What I observed then was this: a cabin that had been given a second wall. Not a new structure, not an addition, not a repair. A second wall built against the first one, the bale courses tight against the cabin's boards, the wire threading holding each course to the others, the clay plaster sealing the whole outer face against weather. The bales were not bearing any load. The cabin frame was still doing what it had always done, carrying the roof, holding the walls square. The bale shell was doing something else entirely. I had been a working carpenter for 6 years. I had helped build or repair every type of structure common to Custer County in that period: frame houses, sod houses, dugouts, barns, grain cribs, root cellars, corn cribs. I had never seen this. I walked to where Clara was working and stood beside her and looked at the west wall. "What's inside?" I asked. She told me. Straw bales, 60 pounds each, wired in courses against the cabin boards. She told me about the wire threading, August's fence wire, the spool he'd bought for the pasture fence he hadn't gotten to, and showed me how the awl went through 5 bales in a line, and the wire followed, and the ends looped back and drew the course together under tension. She told me about the clay plaster and the fiber ratio she'd worked out after the first coat cracked. I listened. I am a man who, when someone who knows something explains it to me, tries not to interrupt. When she was done, I looked at the corner where the north face met the west face, the place where the 2 runs of bales came together at an angle. She had overlapped them at the corner, alternating which face's end bale lapped over which, so that the corner itself was tied together in both directions. It was the same principle as a corner in log construction, where you notch and lap the logs so the corner can't pull apart. I hadn't told her this. Nobody had told her this. She had worked it out from the problem. "The corner," I said. "It would have been the weakness," she said. 2 walls meeting and nothing tying them. I didn't want a seam there. I nodded. I looked at the corner for another moment. "I can come back," I said. "When you've got the west face sealed, I'd like to see how it sits." She said that would be fine. I drove back to the Pritchard job and spent 3 days thinking about the corner. November finished cold, and the first 2 weeks of December finished colder. The work finished with November. By the 30th, the west face was sealed, and the short return on the south end, 2 courses running east from the southwest corner, protecting that exposed angle, was sealed. And Clara stood back on the last afternoon and looked at what they'd built. It did not look like a proper house. A proper house in Custer County in 1898 looked like boards and tar paper and window glass and a stovepipe. This looked like something else. A cabin enclosed in an earthen shell, the walls thick and rounded at the base where the clay had been applied in overlapping strokes, the whole structure lower and broader than it had been, as if the building had grown something around itself against the cold. Hannah said it looked like a fort. Carl said it looked like a loaf of bread. He was not wrong about the shape. Clara thought it looked like something that might work. She would not know if she was right until January proved it one way or the other. But the first thing she did, before she went inside, before she made supper, before she did any of the 50 other things waiting for her attention, was press her palm flat against the sealed face of the north wall and hold it there. Cool, still. Not the radiating cold of a board wall on a November evening, the kind of cold that has already made up its mind to come through and is simply working out the timing, something different. A surface that seemed to have no opinion about the air on either side of it. She held her hand there until she was sure of what she was feeling, and then she went inside. December came in with a cold that was not yet the worst cold but intended to be. The first genuinely hard night was the 7th, a Sunday, the temperature dropping through the evening in the way that a serious winter cold drops, not all at once, but in a steady, committed descent, each hour a few degrees lower than the last, the stars coming out hard and bright, the way they come out when the air is dry and cold enough to make looking at them feel like a small act of exposure. Clara did not check the temperature. She did not own a thermometer, and even if she had, a number would have told her less than the morning itself was about to tell her. She woke in the dark before dawn and lay still. She was waiting for the cold to find her. In the 3 winters since she and August had come to this claim, the cold had always found her by this hour, seeping up from the floorboards that August had set so carefully on his fitted stone foundation, working through the north wall and the west wall until the air in the bedroom had that particular quality of air that has given up trying to be warm. She knew the feeling well enough to wait for it the way you wait for a sound you've heard before. It didn't come. She lay still for another few minutes, breathing quietly, listening. The stove had burned down to coals. She hadn't fed it since midnight. In any of the previous 3 winters, a stove burned down to coals at 4 in the morning would have meant a room she could see her breath in. She breathed out slowly. She could not see her breath. The darkness was the ordinary darkness of a room that has held its warmth through the night, not the glittering particular darkness of a room in which the cold has taken over. She got up, stocking feet on the board floor. She walked to the north wall of the bedroom and pressed her hand against it. In the source, in the wall as it had been, bare boards and tar paper, she would have felt the cold radiating through immediately, the wall itself cold to the touch, the cold seeping from it into her palm. What she felt instead was what she had felt standing at the barn door in October: stillness, a surface that offered no evidence of what was happening on the other side of it, not warm, simply uninformed. She walked to the south wall, the one face she'd left unwrapped, needing the window, and pressed her hand against the boards there. The difference arrived in her palm immediately. The south wall was doing what board walls do, conducting, transmitting, informing her hand of the December night outside. She stood with one hand on each wall, and the difference moved through both palms at once, the one side cold and present, the other side absent and still. And she understood in that moment, with the particular certainty of something you have tested with your own body, that the bale shell was working. She didn't wake the children. She went to the stove, added 2 chips, and adjusted the damper. Then she went back to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the small sounds of the cabin, the faint tick of the stove accepting the new fuel, the wind outside moving across the sealed face of the north wall and finding nothing to say to it. The weeks between the first proof and the last test were weeks she would describe later as the strangest of her life. Stranger even than the weeks after August died. Those weeks had been heavy and clarifying, the grief a weight that simplified everything else. This needs doing, this can wait, this must happen before dark. These weeks were different. These weeks she was waiting. She knew what was coming. Everyone in Custer County knew what was coming. The old-timers talked about it in the way old-timers talk about the things that have broken them before, not frightening themselves with the telling, just naming it accurately: the blizzard years. The winter of '88. The cold that dropped so fast a man could miscalculate by an hour and not survive the miscalculation. She tended the walls. The plaster on the southwest return had developed a small crack in the first week of December. Not shrinkage this time, but differential settling where the base of the bale course had compressed very slightly on the east side. She mixed a thin batch of plaster with a high fiber ratio and worked it into the crack in thin passes, wetting each pass lightly before applying the next. She plastered by lantern light when the afternoons ran out. Hannah held the lamp without being asked, steady and patient, the light not wavering. Carl sat on the porch step wrapped in a blanket and watched, and somewhere around the 7th or 8th pass, he said very quietly that he thought the wall looked like his father would have liked it. Clara pressed another pass of plaster into the crack and didn't say anything. After a while, Carl went inside. She kept working. The crack was sealed by the 14th. She plastered over the sealed area twice more, for good measure. She stacked her fuel against the east wall of the cabin under the 2-course bale overhang she'd left for exactly this purpose. The chips and the few sticks of cottonwood she'd traded for with Werner Cast in exchange for 2 weeks of Hannah's schoolwork assistance with his nephew. She inventoried it twice and calculated that she had enough for a normal winter, running the small iron stove at the careful rate she'd developed over November and December. Not hungry, not wasteful, steady. For a normal winter. In the last week of December, the barometric pressure began to behave in a way that Werner Cast, when he came by with his nephew on the 28th, identified as a sign he had seen before. He stood on Clara's porch and looked at the sky to the northwest for a long time. The sky was ordinary. That was what he was looking at. The ordinariness of it, the featurelessness, the particular blank quality that the sky acquires when something large is organizing itself behind it. January, he said. Just the word, not an elaboration. Clara nodded. He looked at the bale walls. He had looked at them on every visit since November, never touching them, always spending a moment at the corner treatment where the north and west faces joined. He had the habit, she'd noticed, of looking at a structure from the corner, the way an experienced builder looks, because the corner is where the building's character shows. The wire held through December, he said. It held, she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man updating a private ledger. He and his nephew drove north toward their claim. Clara watched them go. She went back inside and looked at her fuel stack, and then looked at the north wall of the cabin from the inside, the bare boards that August had fitted and nailed, still bearing the load they'd always borne, unchanged. She thought about the shell on the other side of those boards, the sealed clay face, the wire-threaded courses, the bales dense with their thousands of small sealed tubes of stopped air. January, Werner had said. She would find out what she'd built. The storm arrived on a Wednesday, the 4th of January, 1899. Clara told me later that she had been watching the northwest sky since Werner's visit, the way you watch something you've been told to watch without being told exactly what you're watching for. On the morning of the 4th, she woke before dawn and lay still, and knew from the quality of the silence that something had changed in the night. Not the storm yet. The silence before it. The particular held-breath quiet that descends when the wind stops in advance of something larger than ordinary wind. She was at the fuel stack before first light, carrying chips inside in August's buckets, making trip after trip until the stack inside the cabin was as high as the ceiling would allow. She brought in the water pails she'd drawn the day before. She brought in the axe and the coil of rope she kept for severe weather, to run a line between cabin and barn if visibility dropped to nothing, and she needed to make that crossing. She brought in the mallet and the spare wire and a bucket of clay she'd kept soft with a damp cloth in the barn. She did not know if she would need these things. She brought them in because a person who has built carefully does not stop being careful on the morning a storm is coming. By the time the children were up and the stove was burning and the porridge was made, the sky to the northwest had changed color, not dramatically. The prairie does not arrange itself dramatically for its storms. It simply presented at about the 8th hour of the morning a sky that had gone the color of old iron, flat and even and without feature, and a wind that had returned from the northwest at a temperature that made the previous 2 weeks seem like a consideration rather than the thing itself. Clara put Carl's second pair of wool stockings on him. She told Hannah where the spare lamp oil was, in case she needed to find it without being shown. She checked the stovepipe elbow, the one Gertrude had mentioned, set a touch shallow, and found it sound. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with the children and waited for January to say what it had come to say. By noon the wind was running at full force, and the snow was not falling. It was flying, horizontally, driven at a speed that made it audible against the plaster face of the north wall, a sound like sand thrown in handfuls, continuous and without pause. Clara looked out the south window, the one she'd left clear when she planned the shell, and what she saw through it was a world reduced to a narrow radius of visibility, and beyond that radius, nothing, white and moving and impenetrable. She fed the stove, not urgently, steadily, the same patient rate she had held to since November, adding fuel in the measured way she'd learned across 2 months of watching what the walls asked for and what they didn't. The walls had been asking for very little. The stove had been doing the last portion of the work, not the majority of it, and she had come to trust this division of labor the way you trust a thing you've tested repeatedly with your own hands. The cabin was warm, not remarkably warm, not the warmth of a room with a fire burning high and hot and burning through your fuel supply to sustain itself. The ordinary warmth of a room that has been warm for a while and intends to stay that way. Hannah sat at the table with her reader. Carl sat beside her, following the words with his finger as she read them aloud, occasionally correcting her on a point that she had already correctly stated. Outside, the storm ran at whatever it was running at. Inside, the stove ticked, and the children read, and Clara mended a split in Carl's boot with the awl and a length of waxed thread. At some point in the early afternoon, she became aware of something she had been registering without naming. The north wall was not speaking. In every winter she had spent in this cabin with August, the north wall in a hard blow was a presence in the room, not loud, not dramatic, but perceptible. You could feel it radiating. You could hear in a hard gust the slight flex of the boards, a sound like the cabin drawing breath. In a cold bad enough, frost formed on the inside surface by morning. None of this was present. The north wall was simply there, doing nothing, offering nothing to the room except the absence of cold. She pressed her hand against it briefly in the early afternoon, a check, a confirmation, and found what she had found in December: stillness, a surface with no opinion about the storm on its other side. She went back to the boot. Gertrude Poole arrived at 2:30. I want to be precise about why, because the reason matters and because people have gotten it wrong when they've told it since. Gertrude did not come because the Poole's house had failed. Alton had kept their frame house heated through the first half of the storm at the cost of burning fuel faster than was comfortable, and Gertrude knew they could last the night and probably the next day if they managed it carefully. They were not in danger, or not yet. But Gertrude had been thinking about the bale walls since September. She had watched the cabin from her place on the cold days of November and December, noting the smoke from Clara's chimney, light, infrequent, the smoke of a fire being maintained rather than driven. She had thought about dryness and stillness and what a sealed wall of compressed straw might actually do to moisture that was trying to form. She had thought about Thomas. She had thought about what a cabin that managed its cold without working the stove hard might mean for the winter health of 2 children who were going to spend every day of January and February inside it. On the second day of the storm, with the temperature still dropping and the wind unchanged, she told Alton she wanted to take the children to Clara's, not because they had no choice, because she wanted to see, in the worst conditions available, whether she had been wrong about something. The walk was a 1/4 mile. I am not going to make it shorter or simpler than it was. A 1/4 mile in a Nebraska blizzard at the temperatures that storm was producing is exactly what it sounds like: a sustained physical effort against wind and cold, and the particular difficulty of knowing where you are when you cannot see more than a few yards in any direction. Alton carried the baby inside his coat. Gertrude held the two older children by their wrists and did not let go. They ran the rope from the house to the fence line first, then followed the fence to the road, then left the fence and moved by judgment and luck through the last 100 yards to Clara's door. When Clara opened it, Gertrude looked like what she was, a woman who had just walked a quarter mile in conditions designed to kill people who miscalculate. Ice on her coat, ice on her eyebrows, the particular pallor that comes when the blood has retreated from the face to protect what it cannot afford to lose. Alton behind her, the baby unstirred and fine inside his coat. The two children at his back, stiff and white-faced and very ready to be inside. Clara stepped back. They came in. Gertrude stepped across the threshold and stopped. She stopped the way I've seen people stop when they walk into a room that doesn't match what they were prepared for. Not a dramatic stop, no intake of breath, no visible reaction, simply a pause, the pause of a person recalibrating. She stood in the doorway with 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and she looked at the interior surface of the north wall. There was no frost on it. In every building Gertrude had been inside that winter, her own house, the store in Broken Bow, Werner Cast's barn, the church at the edge of town, the interior surfaces of north-facing walls grew a fine skin of frost on the nights below 20 degrees. The wall retained heat during the day and lost it overnight, and where the surface temperature dropped below the dew point of the interior air, the moisture froze on contact. It was one of the reliable signs of a cold building, frost on the inside of the north wall. This wall had none. Gertrude stepped fully inside. She reached out and laid her hand flat against the plaster surface, the interior plaster, the thin finish coat Clara had applied over the straw face of the bale course on the inside of the original cabin wall in November. It was cool. It was not cold. It had the temperature of a surface that has been in a heated room all night, not the temperature of a surface conducting January air through 2 inches of board. She pulled her hand back. She looked at Clara. She said nothing. Clara said nothing. Alton had already moved past them both to the stove with the baby. The two pool children were pulling off their outer things. The storm ran outside at whatever it was running at, and inside the stove ticked, and the room held its warmth, and the two women stood looking at each other across the ordinary quiet of a cabin that was managing. Then Gertrude sat down. She kept her coat on for perhaps 3 minutes. Then she took it off. They stayed through the 5th and the 6th. The storm ran 3 days in total. On the worst night, the night between the 5th and 6th, the temperature outside reached 31 below zero, and I know this not because Clara was measuring it, but because Werner Cast told me later that his outdoor thermometer read 31 below at the 4th hour of that morning, and the Voss claim was 4 miles south of his in the same air mass. Inside the Voss cabin, with the Poole family added to it, the stove burned at its patient rate, and the room held at a temperature that required no second coat, no blanket over the children's shoulders at the table, no conscious huddling. It was not summer. It was a room in January in Nebraska, and it was a room you could live in without expenditure of the body's reserves. Alton said on the morning of the 6th, when the wind had finally stopped and the world outside had gone white and still, that the fuel Clara had burned across those 3 days was less than he burned in his own house in a single ordinary January night. He said it quietly, not as accusation and not as praise, in the manner of a man reporting an observation that he has checked twice and found consistent. Clara did not respond to this directly. She was looking at the north wall from the inside, pressing her thumb against the base of the original cabin boards where they met the floor, checking for moisture. There was none. The morning of the 7th, the roads were passable enough for the sled. Before Gertrude climbed up beside Alton, she came back to where Clara was standing on the porch. There was a long moment where neither of them said anything. The sky was the pale, enormous blue that follows a big storm. the kind of blue that seems to have no ceiling, and the snow on the north face of the cabin was drifted to the height of the second bale course, packed against the plaster as tightly as an additional wall, which is, in a sense, what it was. "I want to know how you built the walls," Gertrude said. "The bales, how they're set and wired and plastered, all of it. Alton is going to do the north and west faces before next winter." She paused. "I want to understand what I'm asking him to build." Clara went inside and got August's survey form from the drawer behind the spoons. She brought it out to the porch and held it so Gertrude could see the drawing, the rectangle within the rectangle, the hatched lines indicating bale courses, the small notations on wire spacing and plaster proportions. She explained it the way she had come to understand it, from the outside in, what the shell was doing, why the wire held under lateral load, how the plaster needed to go on in layers and be given time between each one, how the fiber in the clay prevented shrinkage cracking. Gertrude listened in the way practical people listen, steadily, without interruption, with the occasional small nod that means, "I have this, continue." She asked 2 questions, one about the clay-to-fiber ratio in the second coat, one about the wire gauge. When Clara had finished, Gertrude looked at the drawing for a moment. She looked at August's name printed at the top of the form. "He pressed good bales," she said. "Dense. They held their shape." Clara looked at the drawing. "He pressed everything the same way," she said. "He didn't know how to do a thing badly on purpose." Gertrude handed the survey form back. She looked at Clara for a moment with the direct, assessing look that was simply how Gertrude Poole looked at things she was deciding about. Then she nodded once, not a social nod, a carpenter's nod, the nod of a person who has examined something and found it sound. She climbed up beside Alton. The sled moved east across the white field. Clara watched it go until it dropped below the low rise where the road curved toward the Poole place. Werner Kast came in March. He walked around the cabin twice without speaking and examined the repaired crack in the southwest return and asked whether it had been shrinkage or movement. Clara told him shrinkage. He nodded for a long time, then said that in stone construction you repaired dry stone with something wetter, not with more dry stone. You needed a material that could accept movement. He looked at the repair she had done in thin passes with the high-fiber mix. He looked at it for a while. "That's correct," he said. He asked to bring his nephew in April. He brought his nephew and 2 neighbors from the north section. They walked around the cabin, looked at the corner treatment, looked at the wire ends where they were twisted and folded flush against the plaster face. Clara showed them the survey form. She showed them the test she had made in February. A small section of interior plaster chipped away at the base of the north wall to check the bales beneath, the straw inside dry and dense and unchanged, as if the winter had happened somewhere else entirely. Werner's neighbor, a man named Birch with a claim 5 miles north, began his own construction in May. He wrapped the north face of his cabin with 2 courses and the west face with 1, using wire from his own barn supply, clay from a deposit he found along the creek on his section. He came to Clara in June when he was halfway through and showed her his corner treatment, which was different from hers. He had used longer bales at the corner, running them through both faces at once instead of overlapping alternating courses. She looked at it carefully. She said she thought it would hold but that she wasn't certain, and he should watch that corner through the first winter and be prepared to reinforce it. He thanked her. He offered payment. She said there was nothing to pay for. He asked her why not. She thought about it for a moment. "The wire was in August's barn," she said. "The clay was in the creek bank. The straw was in August's field. I found those things. I didn't make them." She paused. "You don't charge for something you found." By the autumn of 1899, 5 structures in that part of Custer County had some form of straw bale shell on their weather faces. Each one was slightly different from the others, adapted to the materials at hand, the specific exposure of each claim, the judgment of each builder. Werner's nephew added a thin coat of lime to his final plaster layer, having read about it somewhere and found it improved the water shedding. Hanna Lemke added coarse sand to her finish coat and found it improved the surface hardness. Clara looked at both modifications when she visited and said they seemed right to her. She was not the authority on this. She said so each time. She was the person who had done it first and thought about it most, which was not the same thing as knowing everything about it. She told people what she'd done and what had worked and what hadn't, and they built from there. And what they built taught her things she went back and applied to her own walls in turn. That is how knowledge moves when there are no institutions to move it. One pair of hands to the next, each pair adding something, none of them claiming more than they'd earned. I drove past the Voss place many times over the years that followed. I watched the bale shell weather and settle and hold. I watched Clara replaster the north face in the autumn of 1901, working the same three-coat method, the same patient evenings with the lantern. I watched Hannah grow tall enough to mix the clay without bending over the bucket. I watched Carl take over the mixing when Hannah left for her schooling in Kearney. In the spring of 1902, I stopped and asked Clara if she would show me the inside of the north wall, the cavity between the exterior plaster face and the original cabin boards, at a point where I could assess the bale condition. She cut a small opening at the base of the wall near the foundation, and we both looked in with the lantern. The straw was dry, dense. The wire was sound, no rust on the galvanized surface. The inner face of the exterior plaster was solid, no soft spots, no moisture staining. The bales looked as they had looked on the day they were pressed in July of 1898 in the field south of the barn by a careful man who didn't know what he was leaving behind. I looked at them for a long time. I have spent 50 years since looking at structures, at how materials hold together, at what a wall is actually doing when it appears to be simply standing there. I have built a lot of things in Custer County, and I have learned a great deal from building them. But the thing that has stayed with me, the thing I have gone back to more times than I can count, is the thing I learned from looking at those bales in the lantern light in the spring of 1902. That a wall's work is mostly invisible, mostly silent, mostly a matter of what it prevents rather than what it does. The best walls are the ones you stop noticing, the ones that have so thoroughly solved the problem they were built to solve that the problem no longer seems like a problem. Clara's wall was like that. After a while, you stopped noticing the thickness of it, stopped noticing the deep-set window on the south face, stopped noticing the rounded corners where the plaster had been applied by hand and had taken the shape of the hands that applied it. It looked, after a while, simply like a house that happened to be warm. She raised both her children there. She replastered every 3 years, the same patient work each time. She lived in that cabin until 1929, when she moved to Broken Bow to be near Hannah's family, and by the time she left, the walls she had built in the autumn of 1898 had stood through 30 Nebraska winters without failing. I pressed my hand against the north face for the last time in 1936. The plaster was cold and still and completely uninformative about the January air on the other side of it. I stood there for a while with my hand against the wall. I thought about Carl, 6 years old, sitting on the step in November with his blanket around his shoulders, handing his mother bale after bale from the stack August had pressed before he died. 1. Mama. 2. That is what a wall needs to do. She understood it when she stood in the barn doorway with a lantern and found her children warm. The rest was just work.